Good evening, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. So this video is entitled Examining, is the Septuagint LXX a 4th century forgery or myth? This is by Jonathan Burris, and so I'm examining this. So this is by Nick Sayers. So Jonathan Burris has come out with this video, and so I just want to go through some of the claims that Jonathan Burris is making. I think he is misinformed about the Septuagint. I don't believe that Jesus used the Septuagint. I don't believe that the early authors of Scripture, God is the author of Scripture, but the penman of Scripture used the Septuagint. I don't believe that at all. And I think it can be easily proven. And it's not a King James only issue like he brings out. John Owen believed this. If you just study the reformers, many reformers thought that the Septuagint was wholly lost. I will just read something by a man named William Whitaker. Now, William Whitaker in 1588, so he's not a King James guy, he's just a brilliant author, someone who was very well respected in the Reformation and post-Reformation era. He says, concerning the Septuagint, learned men question whether the Greek version of the scriptures now extant, or what we have in our hands, be or be not the version of the 70 elders. The sounder opinion seems to be that of those who determine that the true Septuagint is wholly lost, and that the Greek text as we have it is a mixed and miserably corrupted document. Aristeas says that the Septuagint version was exactly conformable to the Hebrew originals, so that when we read and diligently so that when read and diligently examined by skillful judges, it was highly approved by the general suffrage of them all. But this avows differs amazingly from the Hebrew, as well as in other places in books, and especially the Psalms of David. So that was William Whitaker in his book Disputations on Holy Scripture in 1588. So it's not Peter Ruckman, it's not Jeff Riddle, it's not Gail Ripplinger. These guys, they have labeled us all as textual absolutists. These guys are obsessed with labels, okay? Usually when you see people labeling other people, misrepresenting other people, it's usually a sign that they have a flawed argument. One of the first things that people do is they attack their opponent instead of steel manning the argument and saying, well, this is what they really think and believe. They straw man, and they create all sorts of easily debunked narratives that most people don't really believe. Now, of course, the King James Bible is extremely popular, so you're going to get a few weirdos here and there who believe some weird things, who carry a King James around. Big deal. You get some weirdos who believe in young earth creationism. I believe in young earth creationism. You get some weirdos who believe in some Trinitarian doctrines. I believe in the Trinity. It doesn't mean you're part of a group. See, what these guys are trying to do is trying to have guilt by association. So they call you a textual absolutist. So you're in a camp, okay? You've been pigeonholed. You believe in this type of Bible, so you're this type of person. I wouldn't do this to the critical text people. I know some critical text people who are good people, who are nice people, who go out and win souls and love the lost, and they're good husbands, they're good fathers, they're good pastors, whatever. And so I would never say, okay, all these people are all the same. But see, these people, what they want to do is it's like calling all people racist, or all people Nazis, or all people, you're all woke, or you're all Karens, or you're all, we're just all in a group just because of the Bible we read. And some people have come to that decision just because it's like, well, that's the one that their parents have read and their grandparents. But unfortunately, James White's book has muddied all these waters with these 5 different categories of King James onlyist. They can just basically, it's if you are not in the critical text camp, you are a King James onlyist, pretty much. Unless you have some really weird thing like an Aramaic primacy or something like that. But James White in his next book, he'll probably put that in the category as well. These guys, and when I say these guys, I'm not saying all critical text people, because some critical text people are just ignorant of these issues. Just like a lot of King James people are ignorant and they're just making stuff up on the spot. I've seen young earth creationists, when atheists pull them over the coals on certain things, say really stupid answers. And I think, well, that's dumb. I would never say that. And so sometimes Mark Ward, Jonathan Burris, and when I say these guys, because these guys do videos together, James White, Dan Wallace, the type of guys that these people defend, the Textual Confidence Collective and those people, many times they misrepresent what we're saying. They go for the lowest of the lowest. It's usually a comment on their YouTube. Some YouTube commenter said this, and so they're doing a whole video on it. Instead of saying, okay, well, let's look at, Jeff, like, see, the thing is too, why don't they just look at what people like Jeff Riddle? Why don't they look at people like Phil Stringer? Like people who have really good answers to a lot of these issues, but instead they're just going to some guy on YouTube said this, some guy made a passing comment. I ran into a pastor the other day who said this real weird thing, or King James only people believe in Bible numerics, and it's like, look, stop pigeonholing us all as one cohesive group. Why aren't you doing this to all the other groups? Why aren't you saying, well, one guy predicted the rapture in 1988, so all people who predict, all people who believe in a rapture are going to make false predictions. You can make that type of false association fallacy, but as a Christian, you're not really supposed to do that. So please stop putting people into this camp, this textual absolutist camp, because you're putting us all in there. You're saying TR people belong in there, King James preferred people, King James only. And so you basically, Mark Ward calls us all Ruckmanites. If we believe the King James is accurate, we're Ruckmanites. That's what he said. And so you guys have huge errors in your categories, but I think this is on purpose because you just want to demonize your opponents. And we get pretty tired of this. And why are you so obsessed in just calling us names all the time? You're a King James only, you're a textual absolutist, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, William Whitaker in 1588, he said that the Septuagint that they have in their hands is most probably not the Septuagint that was claimed to be in the early days, because this differs from the Hebrew so much. It's a corruption. Listen to this. He says, the Greek text as we have it is a mixed and miserably corrupted document. So I'm just going to get this up on the screen here. And I might even read it again because it is so powerful. Like, imagine if this was, Nick Sayers said this, or Jeff Riddle said this, or Peter Ruckman said this, people would just dismiss it. But this is William Whitaker. If you don't know who William Whitaker is, you really need to know if you're into bibliology. Learned men question. So not just the average person on the street, not just someone you're commenting on a YouTube post. They question whether the Greek version, now remember this is a Greek version. How come many of these guys are correcting the Hebrew Bible with a translation? Don't they say that King James onlyism, they've got the English and they're correcting the Greek, or whoever's doing that somewhere, but they're correcting the Greek with a translation. They say this is the most horrible thing you can do, and they claim that the Textus Receptus is a back translation from an English document and all this sort of strange and bizarre thing that James White comes out with. But aren't they doing the same thing that they're sort of accusing us of? They're going to a Greek version. They're ignoring the Hebrew in places, and they're exalting this Greek translation over the original. So they're actually Septuagint onlyists, or, in a sense where they call us King James onlyists, lump us all in the same category. Okay, well, they're putting this Greek version over and above the Hebrew. Okay. Lerman question whether the Greek version of the scriptures now extant, so what we have in our hands, be or be not the version of the 70 elders. So people are questioning this. It's not just a King James only thing. It's not just a Ruckman thing. People question this. The sounder opinion seems to be that of those who determine that the true Septuagint is wholly lost. Now, this would make sense. If what we have in our hands is corrupt, it's miserably corrupt, it differs amazingly from the Hebrew originals, then you would go, okay, we've probably lost the one that was accurate. And the Greek text as we have it is a mixed and miserably corrupted document. Aristeas says that the Septuagint version was exactly conformable to the Hebrew originals, so that when read and diligently examined by skillful judges, it was highly approved by the general suffrage of them all. But this of ours differs amazingly from the Hebrew, as well as other places and books, and especially in the Psalms of David. So at the end of the day, scholars in the Reformation knew and understood that what they had in their hand, because some of them believed that the Septuagint was an ancient, BC document and all the rest of it. But they're saying, hang on, what we've got today is so different from people were claiming that it's exactly the same as the Hebrew. But when we look at the Hebrew, it's so different from the Septuagint we have today. So the only logical conclusion, he says the sounder conclusion, is that the Septuagint has been wholly lost. It's gone. So do I agree with everything said here? Not absolutely everything, because I think people like John Owen had a better understanding of it, that the Septuagint back in the early church, that what they did was they got the Greek New Testament and they got direct quotations from the Greek New Testament, copied that and pasted it into the Old Testament Greek text that they worked on. So it looked like Jesus had used it and the apostles had used it, when actually it was a copy and paste. It's a what would you call it? A reverse engineering type of feat. So instead of the Septuagint coming first and then the New Testament quoting it and Jesus quoting it, what's happened is scribes have gone, hang on, we've got the New Testament here. Jesus said this. Whoa, he's quoting Psalm 22. Let's copy and paste that. We'll copy it from the Greek New Testament and we'll put it straight into the Greek Old Testament. So then it just becomes like a story where it's like, well, Jesus used it. The apostles used it. And that story is still going today. And so I think there's a lot of flaws. One of the main flaws is the Septuagint. It's not just one thing that we have today. There are many different Septuagints, okay? Because there's a lot of manuscripts. There's a lot of differences between these manuscripts in the oldest and best. And I think that what they had in the early church was a natural reaction to Greeks becoming born again and having a New Testament given to them. They naturally wanted the Old Testament, so they worked on it. And eventually they created a version of the Hebrew scriptures, and that was accurate and that was good. Then came along all these stories, which the vast majority of scholars, even critical text scholars, believe are fake stories about a letter of Aristeas, and so we're going to look into that. And so people are believing, these type of stories that, there were 6 from every tribe, and they all went down to Egypt, and they were there for 72 days. There were 72 scholars. And when at the end of those days, they came out and they all had exactly the same wording. They had exactly the same document. I mean, why God would get 72 of them and do such a miracle? Why wouldn't he just get one person if they all came up with the same thing? But this has been a story that's most people think is a fake. It's a forgery. And so we're going to look into that. So we're getting quite a few comments coming in. I haven't looked at who's in the chat. So Sean Cheatham is saying this needs to be talked about more. Well, one thing I want to do, first off, is I want to just point out that these videos are probably going to come out soon. So this is the conference on August the 3rd, 2024. So this was the academic symposium on the Septuagint by the Reformation Bible Society. So I would say get ready for all these videos because, this is Jeff Riddle, this is Christian McShaffrey, a whole bunch of other guys. They're specifically talking about the Septuagint. So it's going to be a hot topic probably from now until Christmas. We're going to be going through all those videos. So I'll just shut that down, but maybe I'll put that in the chat and you can sort of bookmark it and maybe even chat to Christian McShaffrey, even Jeff Riddle. Christian McShaffrey sometimes comes into this chat here as well. And so, but yeah, so there's going to be a lot said about the Septuagint. Titus says, I believe the 70 only translated the 5 books of Moses. So that's quite a common theme. That is exactly what had occurred, that they did the first 5 books. I'm not for or against anything being BC translated from Hebrew to Greek at all. But I do ask for proof of that. So it's one thing to have a document here and there that might be translated, but also for Jesus to have used it and to have preached from it to his fellow Israelites, for the apostles to have used it, and it's like, oh well, it's a faulty document. So then retroactively saying, well, it's a faulty document back then as well, and so it's okay to use a Bible with holes in it. This is one of their arguments. Is quite strange, and so we'll be looking at all that tonight. A. Hannah says, it is interesting. They're either too dumb to understand Hebrew, so Greek is easier for them to correct by, or they apply thinking of re-inspiration of the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Interesting. Yes, very interesting. A. Hannah. Good sunshine morning to you, Nick and chat. Bold as a lion. It's the morning there. Thus they buy into the fabled myth of the 70. Interesting. Sean says, yes, there's good evidence of that. Docky's in the house. Sean says, look at Psalm 13:3 in the LXX. It's a copy paste of Romans 3. And this is the thing. When you go to like Psalm 13, if you go to Romans chapter 3, if you just read through that, it's a mishmash of lots of different verses. So Paul's obviously going, all the sin and come short of the glory of God. Their mouth is an open sepulchre. This and that. And probably from Romans chapter 3, verse 10 onwards, it's like you go through and there's so many verses that are from all over the Bible, but they've grabbed the whole thing, copied it, and pasted it into Psalm 13. So you can clearly see where they were copying and pasting from the New Testament into the Old. And one of the classic cases is, was it Joseph leaning on his staff, and it's copied and pasted into the wrong story in the book of Genesis. It has a similar narrative, it has similar wording, but it's in the wrong place. And so you can see that they were actually doing this. So and John Owen points this out. Not, hey, Peter Ruckman pointed this out, or, Floyd Jones pointed this out, or D.A. Waitner. No, John Owen. You know what I mean? It's not, these textual absolutists. Half the time when they're saying textual absolutists, they have to include pretty much everyone in the Reformation period, because they're saying the same thing a lot of the time. Sometimes not exactly, but Motorhead 1 said the Septuagint, 72 rabbis were forced to translate the Greek, translate into Greek was only Genesis to Deuteronomy, only, not the rest. No one has that original copy. You see, I think the whole thing is not true. Good morning, Bobby. Motorhead says, it's a fast day of mourning on the 10th of Tevet on the Hebrew calendar. Hellenistic apostate Greek later translate the rest of the Tanakh Hebrew scriptures into Koine Greek. Okay, yes, so I believe that happened in the early church. Now, if some people did translate something somewhere, I'm not against that. If they can find documentation of that. I just don't think that any of the documentation points towards that. Sean Cheatham says, I was at the conference. It was really good. Wow, that's really good. And so, yeah, I wish I was there. I wish I was a fly on the wall. Motorhead says Isaiah 2:22 removed many changes made by Hellenistic apostate translators. Derek McClure says, morning and evening all. Glad to see the conversation is about the Septuagint. Really like the topic. Motorhead said that this is from our Jewish history archives. Rabbi Beryl Ween, History Lessons, Orthodox scholar of Judaism, has details in depth of the history of Judaism. Virginia Hernandez says nobody speaks Old Greek. Yeah, in a sense, like people don't. It's like Old English, no one speaks it, but there are scholars in Old Greek, in a sense of Koine Greek. And if you are a native Greek speaker, you are basically about a grade 4 level of speaking Koine Greek, just by being fluent in modern Greek. Motorhead 1 says there are hundreds of variant versions of the Christian Bibles. None used match the earliest original Koine Greek New Testament or Hebrew sources. There are hundreds of variant versions of the Christian Bibles. None use. Okay. Against the original. So how do you know if we don't have the original Koine Greek? How do you know that it doesn't, or it does? So you've made the claim that there are hundreds of variant versions of Christian Bibles, and none match the earliest original Koine Greek New Testament or Hebrew sources. And so, how do you know what the earliest Koine Greek New Testament is? I'd like to know that. Long before the church existed, 300 BCE, apostate Hellenistic Greeks translate, not during the era of the church. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at tonight. So let's let Burris talk. So let's just get straight into this. Oops, too fast. I've got him on double time. I'll go normal speed. Okay, here we go.
If you like history, you're going to love this video.
Sorry about that.
Is the Septuagint a 4th century forgery? If you like history, you're going to love this video. And if you don't like history, watch it anyway. You may learn something. I was talking with a King James onlyist over the weekend who stated that the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, is a post-Christian 4th century forgery.
Okay, so if if I was to, if someone was to say that to me, I would say, okay, so what do you exactly mean by that? See, Jonathan Burris is just going to keep it all vague, and he's going to jump through a whole bunch of categories. But at the end of the day, when we look at, say, the quote from William Whitaker saying that the Septuagint, so this is in 1588, the Septuagint that we have today is not the Septuagint of the early church. So then we go, okay, what is the Septuagint that we hold in our hands today? Well, it's most probably from Origen, from the fifth column of Origen's Hexapla. This has been in Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus. There are a bunch of other manuscripts that have this, but the earlier edition is most probably lost if it was accurate to the Hebrew, like people claim. And so that's the type of claim that most people make. Okay, so if you were to talk to D.A. Waite, if you were to talk to Scott Jones, most people would say, well, apparently the early Greek text was good, but it's been lost, and now we have a corrupted Greek text, which is most probably from Origen's Hexapla, and it's the fifth column of Origen's Hexapla, and that's what most people have a variant of that today. And so, but that's not what Jonathan Burris is going to talk about. So he's going to talk about the existence of the Septuagint, and he's just going to, like, he keeps talking about the 4th century. Well, the documents that most people get their Septuagint from today are from the 4th century. So, but almost everyone would say, yeah, there were Greek Old Testaments before that. I mean, I don't know anyone who says there isn't. I mean, you'd have to be really like full, like what does Anderson call them? Like rucktards, or, you'd have to be full on right into, some pretty weird stuff to think that there's no Greek New Testament before that. I mean, all the early church fathers, all the early church writers talk about a Greek Old Testament translation. Obviously not all, but enough to prove that there was an early Greek translation. And so, but we're not seeing correct categories here. We're just sort of seeing vague generalizations. But we'll keep going through this.
The actual comment said, maybe because the Septuagint is an obvious post-Christian forgery and was never accepted by the true churches. Just
like, notice he's saying it's a post-Christian forgery. Well, it was probably a post-Christian translation. And what we have of that has been lost today. That a lot of it has just been corrupted. And so, but let's continue. So he's sort of crossing over different things, isn't he? He's saying a post-Christian forgery. So, but he's talking to this guy. I don't know who this guy is, and half the time, do we ever really know who these people are, who they come across, who just have these, outlandish sort of claims that hardly any Textus Receptus person or, King James preferred person or, what would be labeled King James only. I don't really know anyone saying there was no Greek Old Testament before the 4th century. I would say I know people who say that what we have in our hand can be traced back to the 4th century documents, but then probably back to Origen's Hexapla. But then it's sort of like, most people think that the early Greek church did have their own edition of the Septuagint, but we just don't go back before Christ because of the documentation stops there. And it's usually people just quoting the letter of Aristeas. In the early church, they're quoting the letter of Aristeas to say that there was this document, But most scholars, most critical text scholars, and pretty much all Textus Receptus scholars say that it's a fake, it's a forgery, the letter of Aristeas. And so
Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus. Now, this conversation spurred another King James onlyist to quip. Just curious, has anyone produced a Greek copy of the Old Testament written before 300 AD?
You meant it for evil, but God will mean it for good. Thank you for that question. Now sit down.
While this brother was asking this with extreme skepticism, I'm thankful for the question. It allowed me to answer the critics and indeed end the argument. What is the Septuagint and why does it matter? The Septuagint means...
Okay, so we're going to go through some sort of basic history here. But Motorhead said long before church existed, 300 BCE, apostate Hellenistic Greeks translate not during the era of the church. Okay, so I think that got said earlier. And so Titus says, seems like a lot of work on Origen's part to completely translate the whole Old Testament at once like that. Or he might have had a team of people. I'm not really sure exactly. Maybe we can look up Origen Hexapla. Now, I'll just brief through this on Wikipedia, so it's not, it's not a King James only thing. Hexapla, Koine Greek, hexapla, literally sixfold, also called Origenes Hexaplorum, is a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible in 6 versions, 4 of them translated into Greek, preserved only in fragments. It was an immense and complex word-for-word comparison of the original Hebrew scriptures with the Greek Septuagint translation and with other Greek translations. The term especially and generally applies to the edition of the Old Testament compiled by the theologian Origen sometime before 240. And so, say D.A. Waite, I've listened to D.A. Waite say that the Septuagint is probably the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla. And so if we're looking at a date of 240, then obviously this whole video is like, where was the Septuagint before 400? It's like, it's the whole video is just spaced around, like, who's saying this? some random guy said, that said something strange. It's like, the NIV didn't exist in 1982. And it's like, I know it did, and so they're just creating these arguments that are just so easily debunked. Like, who said this? Put his name up there, shame him publicly. Paul said Alexander the coppersmith did this and this other person did this. You can name people. It's been quite interesting watching Jeff Riddle sometimes try and find people who are being talked about. It's like this one person believed this and that, and it's like, who? And just follow these rabbit trails as far as they'll go. And it's like, well, I don't think this person actually really exists. But maybe he does. Maybe someone before 400. But it's a bit of a crossover of, we believe that the evidence is from 400, but then most people are quite skeptical of the dating methodology around Vaticanus, around Sinaiticus, and probably even around Alexandrinus. These should be chemically tested. We should be able to go into these manuscripts, test them, and so we can get a more accurate picture rather than just handwriting techniques. So Light On says you're still in the study of Scripteria and lost what it's really for, but to know who Jesus was. You're going back instead of moving forward, walking with Christ, our Father in heaven. I don't know who you're talking to, Light On. I'm going back instead of moving forward. Okay. What are you talking about? In what way? How can I repent of something I don't know what I'm doing? But maybe you're not talking to me. Maybe you're talking to someone else. So the subsisting fragments of partial copies have been collected in several editions. That of Frederick Field in 1875 being the most fundamental on the basis of Greek and Syrian testimonies. The surviving fragments are now being republished with additional materials since Field's edition by an international group of Septuagint scholars. The work is being carried out as the Hexapler project. So I don't even know about this. This was in 2020. It was talked about. Maybe I can go to the website. Might come up. Oh, it's in archive. So it's okay. The Hexapler project. I have heard of people being involved. Oh, yeah. So Jonathan Mead. Okay. Interesting. And directed by, okay, it's got a full stop there, and directed by Neil McLean. The members of the editorial board are those people. And so, yeah, I'll leave that up to you to jump in to look at the Hexapler and what it is. See also Complutensian Polyglot Bible. So that's interesting. Okay, so we will drop that down. We'll let Jonathan Burris continue.
70 in Greek. It's also known as the LXX, which is 70 in Roman numerals. It's a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian Old Testament. Why does it matter? The Septuagint is incredibly important in Christian history and in Christianity as a whole. It serves as a cultural bridge between Jewish and Greek cultures, and it was widely used by Christians, including the authors of the New Testament. And
including the authors of the New Testament. Now, I think it could have actually been made by some of the apostles. This is an option. You know, I don't think this is far-fetched. That when Paul was, you know, preaching and teaching in the Greek world, Greek-speaking world, that he would think, well, maybe these guys would love to know the Psalms, and, you know, could have spurred, you know, people like, you know, Luke and Titus and others to do translations of it. These Greek-speaking people would have loved that. They would have loved to have known the word in their own language. And so that is a possibility, but let's just say it could have been, you know, elders of churches in, you know, Corinth and Ephesus, you know, piecing this together. And so, so Light On says, you're finding old writings, but you don't know what really the good news is. Okay. Why? How come? How come I don't know? How do you know I don't know? You just come on board and you're like, you don't know. It's like me saying, well, you don't know what 1 + 1 equals. It's like, how do you know? How do I know that you don't know that? You know? So you're already projecting, which means you're lying. You're just making up stuff already. Light On, you sound like a new ager. Holy Scriptures are how we know about our Savior Jesus Christ. God gave us the Holy Scriptures to help us grow as believers and warn unbelievers. Yes, that is spot on. Scripture like KJV.
it was frequently quoted by Jesus himself. While most...
So this is one of the amazing things, like Jesus with his disciples, like just speaking Greek to them. Now, I've got no doubt that people in the area of Israel, in ancient Israel, they most probably knew several languages. A lot of people who are in the West, who are monolingual, to know more than one language is like, you have to study hard to do this, unless you're brought up in a multilingual home. But to a lot of people in the Middle East, they speak many languages. If you talk to anyone who's an Israeli, most of the time they know Hebrew. If you talk to, like, you know, my wife knows 4 languages, and she didn't do any higher learning to know these languages. She studied these at school, but she knows the 4 languages. She can watch any movie in these 4 languages and understand what's going on. And so to me, it's amazing. I study hard and I think about things, and trying to study all sorts of different languages, and it is hard if you don't if you haven't grown up with these languages. But he's saying Jesus spoke Greek. Why on earth would Jesus be speaking Greek? Like, imagine Jesus, doing the Sermon on the Mount in Greek. Like, it would be ridiculous. How many people would just not understand him? Should we just conclude that all the disciples knew Greek? Yeah, it's a strange concept. I've got no doubt some of them most probably knew either Latin or Greek or other languages. But he's just making this claim, and this is because most people can't grasp, like what John Owen was saying, that the Septuagint is reverse engineered. It is copied from the New Testament and pasted into the Old. And so this is something that most critical text people reject, and they won't admit as an option. And this has become one of their pillars for critiquing the Old Testament, for chopping and changing the Hebrew, because we see in the New Testament they will run to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and corrupt documents to destroy the Word of God and to add and subtract and change. But what can they do in the Old Testament? Oh, they go to the Septuagint. They say, oh, this is a better reading here. They can sneak in words. They can change words. I've seen people do this, like even just on the flight. People who say they're defending the Hebrew, defending the Greek, defending the King James, like say Chuck Missler. I remember he was saying the King James is the best text and talking about a basic sort of TR thing. And then he said, I think it was in Genesis 5 or something like that, where it says, and then men began to call on the name of the Lord. He's like, no, that's not the correct word. The correct word is blaspheme the name of the Lord. I'm like, how can you just change the word of God like that? But he used to just grab the Septuagint whenever he wanted. And this is what we see is most people are trained to be like a Bart Ehrman and just go, look at a word and go, well, I don't like it, or it doesn't fit my narrative, or I've got a new book coming out that talks about Enoch, and I better make it a little bit spicier. So I'll just twist a word here and there, and we'll add a bit of Septuagint there, and then we've got a bestseller. So unfortunately, what we see in this generation is people have become Bart Ehrmans. They feel like they can add, subtract, and change the word of God at a whim, and use translations to distort the Hebrew. And so I've got nothing against translations. I've got nothing against looking at absolutely everything. But I am critical of these guys when they say, oh, you can't, King James people are changing the Greek with the English. They make this claim. But then they go to the Greek translation and correct the Hebrew. It's like you just scolded people for that. Why are you doing it yourself? So Derek McClure says, David Daniels said in his book, Did Jesus Use the Septuagint?, that a wealthy convert named Ambrose gave Origen 7 stenographs to write every word. Okay, very interesting. I have not read David Daniels' book on that. It would be an interesting book to look at. He said 7 longhand scribes to make them into books. Okay. Titus said, I had forgotten about that, Derek. Thanks.
Modern Bibles are based on the Hebrew Masoretic text. There are also critical Old Testament readings in the Old Testament that follow the Septuagint reading over the Hebrew Masoretic text. The Septuagint also provides a textual witness to the Hebrew Bible. Modern Bibles, including the Latin Vulgate and even English translations, are impacted by the Septuagint.
So one of the main problems is Jonathan Burris is talking about the Septuagint. The Septuagint. Okay. when there are many different Septuagints, and it looks like that one whole stream of Septuagint is lost. That the one that people were talking about that was accurate, that was very close to the Hebrew, it seems like that one is gone, and there's just all these others now.
Septuagint. Where did it come from? Following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his generals divided his empire into three. The Antigonids controlled Greece, and the Seleucids controlled Antioch.
I don't think he divided it into three. I wasn't going to even talk on this, but I'm pretty sure he divided the kingdom into four parts, didn't he? And the Seleucid kingdom is the fourth part. So anyway.
Antioch and Seleucia in Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia, while the Ptolemaic dynasty controlled Egypt with Alexandria as its capital. These dynasties continued to spread the Greek language throughout their kingdoms. And we're going to focus on the Ptolemies. Most of you have heard of the last pharaoh of Egypt and the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. Her name was Cleopatra VII to be exact. When she died in 30 BC, Egypt became a Roman province. But during the reign of the first Ptolemaic pharaoh, King Ptolemy I of Egypt, his son, Ptolemy II, also named Philadelphus, famously built the Alexandrian Library. Ptolemy I was a historian. He wrote an account of Alexander's campaign. It probably wasn't finished until his son, Ptolemy II, took power, but by 295 BC, they were already collecting early writings of Aristotle and Theophrastus, and those were collected for the library with the intention of the library to be a collection of all knowledge, according to the letter of Aristeas.
Okay, so Jonathan Burris is just talking about general history. Then he's like, okay, let's talk about the letter of Aristeas. So we've got to understand what this is. So again, I won't go to Ruckman and Ripplinger. We'll just go to bog standard Wikipedia. Sometimes it's biased. I mean, they say what Codex Montfortianus is a 1520 document. It's like 1520. It's just amazing that they make these claims, But the letter of Aristeas to Philocrates, I think that's how you would pronounce that, is a Hellenistic work of the 3rd or early 2nd century BC, considered by some biblical scholars to be pseudepigraphal, so which is a falsely attributed work, text whose claimed author is not the true author, or a work whose real author attributed it to a figure of the past. The name of the author to whom the work is falsely attributed is often prefixed with the particle pseudo, etc. So we get the drift. The letter is the earliest text to mention the Library of Alexandria. Okay. Josephus, who paraphrases about 2/5 of the letter, ascribes it to Aristeas of Marmora, and to have been written to certain Philocrates. Now, I've got to get this guy's name right, because I'm into Urdu. Maybe into, actually just
Philocrates.
Philocrates. The letter describing the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible by the 72 interpreters sent to Egypt from Jerusalem at the request of the librarian of Alexandria, resulting in the Septuagint translation. Some scholars have since argued it is fictitious. Okay. So it says here in the footnote, the narrative is open to the gravest suspicion, and the letter abounds with improbabilities and is now generally regarded as more or less fabulous. Okay. So, I mean, this is the conclusion of the vast majority of critical text scholars. So I just sort of point that out. It's good to know that most scholars think that this is not true. The letter of Aristeas called so because it was a letter addressed from Aristaeus of Marmora to his brother Philocrates, deals primarily with the reason the Greek translation of the Hebrew law, also called the Septuagint, was created, as well as the people and processes involved. The letter's author claims to be a courtier of Ptolemy II of Philadelphus. Over 20 Greek manuscript copies of the letter are known to have survived, dating from the 11th to the 15th century. Okay, so just think about what's being said here. The letter is also mentioned and quoted in other ancient texts, most notably in Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus in 93 AD, The Life of Moses by Philo of Alexandria, AD 15, and in an excerpt of Aristobulus of Alexandria, 160 BC, preserved in Paratio Evangelia by Eusebius. Okay, so what you got to understand too is these dates, that's when these books were supposedly written, but it's actually preserved by Eusebius, who's like 200 years later. So that's got to be understood. So in detail, the work relates to how the king of Egypt, presumably Ptolemy II of Philadelphus, is urged by his chief librarian, getting tongue twisted at 11 o'clock at night here, Demetrius of Phaleron, to have the Hebrew law translated into Greek, and so add the knowledge of the Hebrews to the vast collection of books the empire had already collected. The king responds favorably, including giving freedom to the Jews who had been taken into captivity by his predecessors and sending lavish gifts, which are described in great detail, to the temple in Jerusalem, along with his envoys. The high priest chooses exactly 6 men from each of the 12 tribes. So that in itself is rubbish, because the only people who could do any type of work on the text were the Levites. So the Levites, they were the priests, they were the ones who would work on the text, not just anyone from any tribe. And so that would go against Hebrew culture, Hebrew custom. Giving 72 in all, he gives a long sermon in praise of the law. When the translators arrive in Alexandria, the king weeps for joy for the next 7 days, puts philosophical questions to the translators, the wise answers to which are related in full. The 72 translators then complete their task in exactly 72 days. The Jews of Alexandria, on hearing the law read in Greek, hearing the law read in Greek, requested copies and lay a curse on anyone who would change the translation. So if you change the Septuagint, you're cursed. The king then rewards the translators lavishly and they return home. Elements of this narrative are retold in the Babylonian Talmud and in the tractate Megillah. The main goal of the 2nd century author seems to be to establish the superiority of the Greek Septuagint text over any other version of the Hebrew Bible. The author is noticeably pro-Greek, portraying Zeus as simply another name for the God of Israel. And while criticism is lodged against idolatry and Greek sexual ethics, the argument is phrased in such a way as to attempt to persuade the reader to change rather than as a hostile attack. The manner in which the author concentrates on describing Judaism is particularly its temple in Jerusalem could be viewed as an attempt to proselytize. Okay, so then we've got scholars who are criticizing it. The scholars have noted that Demetrius of Phaleron, a client of Ptolemy I of Sota, is not a good candidate as a collaborator with Ptolemy II of Philadelphus. Roger S. Bagnall notes that Demetrius made a strategic mistake at the beginning of Soter's reign, supporting the ruler's older half-brother, and was punished with internal exile, dying soon afterwards. The Spanish humanist Luis Vives is sometimes quoted as being the first to have exposed the fictitious character of the letter in his 22 Libros and a whole bunch of other Latin words in 1522. But a reading of Vives' Latin text reveals that he only transmitted Jerome's criticisms of the Aristaeus story and added nothing critical of his own account. So Jerome was critical of this story, which is quite interesting. The inconsistencies. So I'm not saying, we're just reading through Wikipedia. So I'm not, some people obviously who are for a BC document or for an AD document, people can chop and change this, but this is just sort of the bog standard story. Okay. The inconsistencies and the anachronisms of the author, exposed by many 17th century scholars, were collected and presented by Humphrey Hodie, 1659 to 1706. Hodie placed the writing closer to 170 to 130 BC. His Oxford dissertation in 1685 provoked an angry and scurrilous reply from Isaac Vossius, who was from 1618 to 1689, who had been librarian to Queen Christina of Sweden. In the appendix to his observation on Pomponius Mela, 1686, to which Hodie conclusively replied in notes to his reprint of 1705. Due to this, the author of the letter of Aristaeus is most often referred to as pseudo Aristaeus. Modern scholarship is unanimously with Hodie. So think about that. This is the admission of Wikipedia that this is pseudo Aristaeus. So it wasn't written by Aristaeus. This is a fake. Okay. With these fantastical stories that they did it in 72 days, they all came out with the same stuff. Victor, and that looks like a bit of a Russian name, Cherikova, summed up the scholarly consensus in 1958. Modern scholars commonly regard the letter of Aristaeus as a work typical of Jewish apologetics aiming at self-defense and propaganda directed to the Greeks. Here are some instances illustrating this general view. In 1903, Friedlander wrote that the glorification of Judaism in the letter was no more than self-defense, though the book does not mention the antagonists of Judaism by name, nor does it admit that its intention is to refute direct attacks. Stein sees the letter as a special kind of defense, which practices diplomatic tactics, and Tremonito also speaks of an apologetic and propagandist tendency. Vincent categorizes it as a small, unapologetic novel written for the Egyptians, that is, the Greeks in Egypt. Pfeiffer says this fanciful story of the origin of the Septuagint is merely a pretext for defending Judaism against its heathen denigrators. I was like, man, I haven't seen that word for a while. It's really bad. For extolling its nobility and reasonableness. I shouldn't read long text like nearly at midnight, but I'm getting it. And first striving to convert Greek-speaking Gentiles to it. Schuler classes the letter with a special kind of literature, Jewish propaganda in pagan disguise, whose works are directed to the pagan reader in order to make propaganda for Judaism among the Gentiles. Andrews, too, believes that the role of a Greek was assumed by Aristaeus in order to strengthen the force of the argument and commend it to non-Jewish readers. Even Gutman, who rightly recognizes that the letter sprang from an inner need for the educated Jew, sees in it a strong means for making Jewish propaganda in the Greek world. But Cherikova continues, in this article, an attempt will be made to prove that the letter of Aristeas was not written with the aim of self-defense or propaganda and was addressed not to Greek but to Jewish readers. In 1902, I. Abrahams writes, "It is, to my mind, no longer improbable that the king would communicate in writing with his librarian, as Aristeas asserts, though Hoddy directs his satire against this very point." In 2001, Bruce Metzger writes, "Most scholars who have analyzed the letter have concluded that the author cannot have been the man he represented himself to be, but was a Jew who wrote a fictitious account in order to enhance the importance of the Hebrew scriptures by suggesting that a pagan king had recognized their significance and therefore arranged their translation into Greek." Scholars avid for the scant information about the library and Museum of Alexandria have depended on pseudo-Aristeas, who has the least attractive quality in a source, to be trusted only where corroborated by better evidence, and there unneeded, Roger Bagnell concluded. Okay, so I'm glad I've got through that, but that's interesting. In 2001, that Bruce Metzger said most scholars who have analyzed the letter have concluded the author cannot have been the man he represented himself to be, but was a Jew who wrote a fictitious account in order to enhance the importance of the Hebrew scriptures by suggesting that a pagan king had recognized their significance and therefore arranged for their translation into Greek. So it's Bruce Metzger, The Bible in Translation, Baker Academic, 2001, page 15. So I think this is something that that Burris really needs to think about, because obviously he would revere Bruce Metzger as a guru in the field, as James Whitewood, as anyone in the critical text camp usually does. Metzger is, the one who taught Bart Ehrman. So I'll jump through some of these comments. So I'll get that picture up there while I'm doing it. Calvin Clemens says, yes, Daniel prophesied Alexander's reign and how it would be divided into 4 parts. Yeah, I sort of picked that up and went, I'm not sure. The 3-part thing just didn't sit right. Randy Wheeler says, hello, my long-winded brother in Christ. I hope you're doing well. Won't be able to watch the whole video at once as I'm at work, but we'll be checking it from time to time. Yes, thanks for joining, Randy. Sorry these videos go long, but that's just the way it is. I've tried to make them shorter. I used to make them shorter, and they just keep getting longer and longer and longer. And so that's just the way life is. Quad Rex says, exciting. I personally think it was a forgery. At least that's my current position. I'm in agreement with David Daniels on the matter. Okay, that's interesting. Matt Singleton is in the house. Hey, guys. Hey, Matt. Good to see you. I did have read your text, and I've been meaning to reply. But yeah, and I did have a chat to your friend overseas, and we just had just a general chat. And I just said, look, I can't guarantee that we would visit or anything like that, because I sort of have to play it safe. And I can't just make up where I'm going to go and things like that when I'm over there. And so oftentimes we're sort of dealing with people who are really, really well known. I'm not saying that they're not good or whatever, but sometimes, we're on a tight schedule and we got so many things sorted out. So I just thought I'd explain it to you, Matt, because what you were saying was genuinely good. And I was going to write a thing, but sometimes it's easier just to chat like this. But they sound like they're doing a really good work over there. So it sounds like they're the real deal. Mike Holner is living the dream. I watched your video the other day on the country song on who's that guy? Tucker Carlson's program. That was a pretty interesting show. I really liked the Get a Brain commercial that you had on there. If you suffer from symptoms of stupidity and all this sort of stuff, it's gold. I really like that. I like how you do that. You remind me of a good friend of mine here in Australia. He was actually a federal police officer, and had really good sense of humor like that. So Right the Vision Ministry says a title relevant to the so-called LXX is the Septuagint fallacy, an indictment of modern criticism by the Reverend W.I. Phillips in 1918. Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks for that, Mike. Matt said that's fine. Paul Anker says, any KJV debates in the pipeline? I was talking to a friend about it just before I jumped online, and I said, look, we've got like 10 really good debaters lined up, like, and Jonathan Sheffield and a whole heap of people said that they would debate. I mean, Peter Van Cleek, he's like, I'll debate anyone. But I'm just not seeing people lining up, and people know about this. I've got people contacting me saying, oh, I've contacted this guy and I've contacted this other guy. But I don't think the critical text guys feel that their case is strong enough. I think that they're actually backing down. Like that's the only conclusion I can put out there, is that a lot of these scholars, are threatened by what I would see as superior scholarship and a superior narrative. And so Matt Singleton says, YouTube scholar Gavin Ortland defended the LXX, but admitted he is not trying to find the original text. Okay. Calvin Clemens says, maybe this guy simply misspoke. I will give him the benefit of the doubt, but if he didn't and truly doesn't know Alexander's kingdom was divided into 4, that's troubling and telling. Well, I mean, look, sometimes when Jonathan Burris jumped onto the Textus Receptus Academy, he was just sort of throwing lots of information. I was like, hang on. Erasmus said this and that. He didn't say this other thing. That's sort of unproven. But he was like, no, he said it. And it's like, well, no, we sort of, we're not like cafeteria TR people. We eat and breathe this stuff for breakfast. It's like we're into this. We study this stuff out. And so it sort of got to the point where he just was he had his hammer out. Everything was a nail. And I know at the time he was going through a whole church split and a whole bunch of stuff. I think he was trying to convert his church away from the King James or something, and it didn't work, and he had to leave. And so, he's probably just going through a hard time or whatever. But I sort of find that's why I'm doing a video on this, because I find some of what he's saying is very easily debunked. So I haven't really prepped much for this. I'm just sort of like, well, let's just go through it and just show what he's saying wrong. And it's not hard to, figure out. All right.
3rd or early 2nd century BC work gives us our
3rd or early 2nd century BC work. So let's see, is he going to tell us all that it's a fake?
Earliest mention of the Septuagint and of the Library of Alexandria. His letter, written to a man named Philocrates, tells how Ptolemy II wanted to add the Jewish scriptures to the Library of Alexandria. He records correspondence between Ptolemy II and Eleazar, the high priest, as he was requesting the translation. Aristeas travels to Jerusalem with released Jewish captives and describes the Second Temple in detail. Eleazar is convinced to send 70 scholars to go to Ptolemy II and translate the Hebrew Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, into Greek. Aristeas describes the 70 scholars that he led to their house on the island of Pharos in Alexandria, where they supposedly miraculously produced the work in 72 days. Now, there are plenty of embellishments in this letter to spice up the events and make it more fantastical. But that's a story for a different day. What we do know is that according to the Babylonian Talmud, a 5th century AD compilation of Jewish teachings. The Septuagint that was initially produced only included the Torah. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus.
Okay, so he's saying that's according to a 5th century document, the Babylonian Talmud. Okay. And so, yeah, interesting that's where he's going. Okay.
Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The other books were translated over the next 150 years and added to it. And so by around 100 BC, it's believed that the entire Jewish scriptures had been translated into Greek. That means that the Greek Jewish scriptures were referred to in this letter almost 500 years before the 4th century AD, when some King James onlyists date it to as a forgery.
Oh. Okay, so because the Babylonian Talmud, okay. I'd like to know, does anyone know where, like, beside the letter of Aristeas, because of course that's going to make these claims, what other documentation, because he's saying 5th century documentation, I would have thought that early church writers would have said something better than that, because it doesn't sound like he's gone to the strongest source. If that's the strongest source for that, now I'm just going to quickly go back through this Wikipedia article and just see. The first 5 books, the Hebrew law. Okay. Anyway, let's just continue on.
Then there's Philo of Alexandria. In addition to Aristeas' letter, we also have references to the Septuagint by Philo of Alexandria. He wrote about the Septuagint in the early 1st century.
Okay, so in the Wikipedia article, it was said that he wrote in 15 AD. Okay, so I am pretty certain that that is from Eusebius, who's sort of like, hundreds of years after that. Retroactively, talking about these things and saying, okay, this guy wrote this thing. So let's just continue on. He might bring out a few other things. We might have to go down a few other rabbit trails. But if you've got anything interesting to add into the chat about this, let me know.
And he lived between 20 BC to around 50 AD. He was a contemporary of Jesus. In his De Vita Moses, or On the Life of Moses.
Hang on. So he was saying he lived from 20 BC. Sorry, I thought you said 80. Yeah.
He wrote about how Ptolemy II commissioned the translation for the library at Alexandria. He recounts much of the Aristeas letter in another work, De Vita Contemplativa, or On the Contemplative Life. He mentions the Septuagint being used by a particular sect of Jews called the Therapeutae, who studied the scriptures in both Hebrew and Greek. And then we have Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus lived from AD 37 to around 100 and was a contemporary of the apostles and the New Testament authors. He recounts about 40% of Aristeas' letter and speaks of the Greek Septuagint's translation in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 2. If the Septuagint is a forgery from the 4th century AD, then those in on the conspiracy would not only have had to produce the Greek Septuagint in the 4th century AD, but they would also have had to collect all the copies of the letter of Aristeas, but also every single copy of both Philo's works that refer to the Septuagint and also Flavius Josephus' famous Antiquities of the Jews, and insert this story into all of them. Now, keep in mind that these are not Christian authors. And if you think that this is a concerted effort between Christians and the Jews to fabricate this myth of the Jewish scriptures existing in Greek during the time of Christ, you need to remember that the Jews largely abandoned the Septuagint because of how Christians embraced it. And to demonstrate this, Justin Martyr, who lived from 100 to 165 AD, wrote in his Dialogue with Trypho about the interpretation of Isaiah 7:14.
Okay, so I think when you look at it, like say Bruce Metzger saying, most scholars who have analyzed the letter have concluded the author cannot have been the man he represented himself to be, but was a Jew who wrote a fictitious account in order to enhance the importance of the Hebrew scriptures by suggesting that a pagan king had recognized the significance and therefore arranged for their translation into Greek. Okay, so very interesting that he's saying, basically he seems to be rejecting that narrative and going with the wholesale story that this is like a true document because it's been quoted. So this must have happened, and this Greek edition was around, rather than going, okay, why, like who was using this early document? Why were Greek-speaking people using this document? Now, as I said earlier, if there is BC evidence for a Greek translation of anything, if it's Hebrew, if it's Syriac, if it's whatever, it's like, okay, it doesn't really affect me whatsoever. But we're going with the evidence of what these guys are claiming that Jesus used a Greek translation. Okay. Now, Bruce Metzger is saying that letter is fake. It's a forgery. The information in that letter is it's basically a fictitious account to enhance the importance of the Hebrew scriptures, etc. And so it just makes you wonder, how can you jump from that to, no, Jesus used this? You know what I mean? Because his evidence is going back to this letter. So it's almost like the whole concept, like when you look at, say, John Owen. John Owen, he talked about Genesis 47:31 and Hebrews 11:21, where it talks about the whole concept of having, someone leaning on the top of their staff and, this type of thing. Now, this was mentioned by John Owen, that it was retroactively copied and pasted from the New Testament into a Greek Old Testament. Okay. So I think it's more natural to think that the early church, when we want to know what the Old Testament says, so they did a translation, and that translation, as that was continually copied and spread around, that some people grabbed quotations from the New Testament, copied it and pasted it straight in, just like we have seen with Romans chapter 3 into Psalm, I think it was Psalm, was it 13, or I can't remember what that was, but the whole section in Romans chapter 3 is copied, which is an amalgamation of lots and lots of different verses, all like a cluster of verses from all different places in the Bible, and then it's pasted straight into a psalm. So you can see where they're doing this. And so people just going, okay, well, the reason that we think Jesus used it is because, hang on, that's exactly, that LXX has the exact same words that Jesus used in the New Testament. There we go, Jesus used it. Well, obviously, even John Owen, not a King James only guy, he clearly used Hebrews 11 21 and Genesis 47:33 with the concept of staff and bed and all this sort of stuff. He used that concept to prove that what I'm saying is correct. And so it's not just a King James only sort of thing, textual absolutist thing. This is people in the Reformation understood this. Matt Singleton says, just wondering, is the Sumerian Pentateuch leaning toward the Masoretic canon? Maybe that could be useful. Okay, I'll have to look into that, Matt. He's about to pledge allegiance to the Apocrypha. You can see that, some people who get into a lot of this literature around that time, they do dive into the Apocrypha, and unfortunately, sometimes you hear them talking about the, Enoch and Nephilim and all sorts of strange things. Bluey's in the house. Hey, y'all. Boulder's Lion says, why would we trust anything that comes out of Alexandria, Egypt scholars? Bluey says, I think the evidence is there that the Septuagint being written 3rd century BC, that's not to say it's inspired in its translation. But I guess the thing is I'm looking for the exact evidence. So when it comes to manuscript evidence, because we have manuscript evidence that is 1,000 years later. We have people writing about this letter. Pretty much everyone is just writing about this letter. Okay. Now, if you have, just say the letter was written before Christ, you still have, people who are revered in the critical text circles, such as Bruce Metzger, saying that it's a fake, it's a forgery. The letter was not written by who it was claimed to be written by. It's fantastical. The 72 days. They all came out with the same thing. This whole thing. But this is what I would think about if I was to do a deep dive into this. I would think, okay, who was quoting this letter of Aristeas, and was it squeezed into earlier literature? Because if there is a fake account, having someone start talking about this fake account could be another fake account. You know what I mean? It's sort of like the one where it's like, okay, this is the 15th, the AD 15 date, and apparently he lived up to 50. Perhaps his writings were tampered with to make it look like he was quoting that, in a sense, so it looks older. So these are all things that you've got to take into consideration. And I'm not just saying it, we just simply just don't believe it. Also look at the fact that, hey, it could be. And, this could have been something that was, told that had happened 100 years before Christ. But what's the evidence that we have this? Okay. And so that's the thing. I want to look at manuscript evidence. I want all of these manuscripts tested. See, the thing is, you might think, oh, I'm hyper skeptical. A lot of people would accuse me of that, where, say James White, he would say that Bart Ehrman's hyper skeptical. And I've heard him say that about Jeff Riddle and a whole bunch of other people. All I want is facts. Asking for more evidence is not wrong. If you have committed a murder, okay, you don't want more evidence. You want the evidence hidden. And what I find is people are not interested in dating Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. They don't want to date these manuscripts. They just want to make claims that they're this old because of the handwriting. Okay. Now, the Museum of the Bible. they had a whole heap of Dead Sea Scrolls. Every single one of them was proven to be a fake in 2020. So when they got proper scientists in to test these manuscripts to see how old they were, ding ding, lo and behold, they're fakes. They're modern day forgeries. I've talked about Archaic Mark a lot. Archaic Mark was a document that was said to be a 13th century Byzantine text, which had a lot of Vaticanus readings in it. So the Ahlens, we know that Nestle Aland text is named after Kurt Aland. The Ahlens, Kurt and Barbara, they were stoked in this manuscript. Many people were. They were saying this is fantastic, a 13th century document showing that Vaticanus was used. It was not just a standalone text sort of thing, because, it's just sort of like an aberration of history. But, it was used. A 13th century document has it, but then they scientifically tested it, and it has Prussian blue ink in it, which proves it's a modern day forgery. And so the Ahlens, right up there with Bruce Metzger, right up there with Carlo Martini, the Jesuit guy, right, with the best of them, they were duped by this. And so that's why I question everything. It's a normal, natural thing to question whether something's genuine and to go, okay, what's, like, even with Sinaiticus, people go, no, it's not a forgery. Well, they're just going by faith. Like, say, someone to say that Sinaiticus is a 350 document, how do they get to that position? Well, it's like, the scholars have said so. Okay, which scholars? Elijah Hixson said this and that. Okay, who's Elijah Hixson getting his information from? And so the thing is, are they better scholars than the Ahlens? The Ahlens were sucked in by a 13th century manuscript. The Museum of the Bible, they had a bunch of Dead Sea Scrolls, all fakes, modern day forgeries. And so that's the thing. The first thing that comes to my mind with this letter is that perhaps some people in that early church period were trying to make out that their Greek text was better than the Hebrew for whatever reason. That's one avenue I'd go down. The other avenue is, okay, I'd go down the route of that this story was a BC story, but where's the fruit of this? Where's the facts of a translation done of the first 5 books? And you'd have to piece the whole story together. So I guess as I go through and look at all the Septuagint sermons that have just happened in the Reformation Bible Society collective sort of thing that's just happened at the beginning of this month, no doubt I'm going to grow in understanding and all the rest of it. And I really should. A lot of people recommend me to get into Dave Daniels' material on this, and so I really should. I think I have been through and briefed over a lot of it, but sometimes you learn a few little key bits here and there, and things stick better. Matt Singleton says the letter can be early, but the manuscript might not be finalized for centuries because we still do not have that manuscript, and the letter is still a fraud. Yes, that's a really good point, Matt. Yeah. Victo5 says Alexander the Great ordered all known writings in his day to be translated into Greek to be kept at the Library of Alexandria. Okay, well, that's interesting, but where do we get that information from? That's another thing. Where do we get that information from? Because, I guess Alexander the Great also went to just down the road from where I will be going in Pakistan. Now, he was about 30 kilometers away from where I lived for a year. Now, the writings in ancient Sanskrit are prevalent there. no doubt he would have known about those, but I'm not sure if he translated those. But yeah, it'd be interesting to find out, to what extent that happened, that occurred. Matthew Southwell says, why don't you talk about the dating Bruce Metzger gives for the letter of Aristeas? I guess I will when I come across that information. I just read through a Wikipedia article, it had Bruce Metzger there, so I just read that. I'm not saying I'm an expert on this topic. I'm just talking about it, getting as much information as I can. But there are things that Jonathan Burris is saying which are not, I would question, and there's things just sort of not adding up here. Pastor Brett says, hello, Nick and all. Hey, Pastor Brett, I have been listening to your material the last few days. I guess we just talk past each other a little bit because I get up in the morning and you've already done a video and it's a few hours old, and so I'll listen to that, and then the next day it sort of happens again. And that's the problem of me living on the other side of the planet. Victo5 says the original Greek translation was destroyed when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. Okay, so there is a really interesting history of the Library of Alexandria done by atheists. Now, I'm going to actually find this. YouTube. Now, I do listen to these guys. Now, you got to understand these guys are atheists, but they thoroughly represented the position that I have, I guess, defended, since 2005 of Easter. And so that's when I started to get into their material. But obviously they're atheists, so they're not going to, say, oh, the Bible says this and that, or the Bible's correct. But what they were doing was pulling other people over the coals who were atheists, who are making all sorts of fantastic claims against Christians. And they were saying, hang on, what you're saying here is just simply untrue, and it's easily debunked. And so now I've just got to find this. I'm just going through all of my subscriptions, and I have decided that I'm going to subscribe to lots and lots of different people in support of them. But okay, I have to go to all subscriptions. There we go. Maybe I'll just type in atheist. Okay, where are we? It won't be a sec. I'll just see if I can find this. Yes, History for Atheists. There we go. So if you go to their videos, so Easter and the Pagan Origins. So that's a really good video to watch. That was a year ago. And so what I've seen in the last 20 years since I've written the Easter article and promoted that Easter has never been pagan. Lots of people, like even Mark Ward, Wes Huff, a lot of these guys are now saying that. And where James White in his book says it's related to Ishtar, because of the phonetic similarity, Ishtar is Easter, that's basically it. But when you look at the true etymology, Easter comes from the Germanic Auferstehung, which means resurrection. So Easter means resurrection, if you follow my studies through on that. And so, this was the video that got me in about a year ago. And then I watched their one on the library. Yeah, no, that must have been it. Is Easter pagan? So they've got ones like Constantine in the Bible. So they've got guys like Jesus mythicism, this type of thing. But the Great Library of Alexandria, part 1 and part 2, gold. If Christians could get this in their mind. So what I'll do, I'll just grab this. Now, I know I'm promoting an atheist thing. Obviously, I don't agree with everything said. If they start swearing in the middle of it, it's just the way it is. But Enter if you dare. Okay, so TurretinFan says, you say that it's an odd argument, that it's okay to use a Bible with holes in it, but isn't that in the KJV letter to the reader? Yes, it was commonly believed that it was a historical thing. But see, the thing is that like what I said about William Whitaker, so I'll just get that back up here. Where am I? Actually, I've sort of lost that page. Where am I? Here. So the quote by William Whitaker in 1588, he's basically saying that the Septuagint that we have today is wholly lost. Or the Septuagint that they had back then, sorry, that was accurate to the Hebrew and all the rest of it is lost. So the King James translators believed that they had a Septuagint there, but it was exactly like the Hebrew. But when you look at the King James translators, notice their wording here. It says, neither did we run over the work with that posting haste that the Septuagint did, if that be true, which is reported of them. So they're questioning that, saying it could be a myth, but we're not really sure, that they finished it in 72 days. And then they're saying, okay, Josephus, neither were we barred or hindered from going over it again. Once having done it, like St. Jerome, if that be true, which he himself reporteth. So that they were questioning, if it be true. And so they would have known. William Whitaker was sort of like the Bruce Metzger, a correct Bruce, a TR Bruce Metzger, of the day. In 1588, with he's like learned men question whether the Greek version of the scriptures be now extant be or be not the version of the 70 elders. So they were like, okay, if they did use the Greek, which some of them thought that they had done, it's not what they had in their hand in the Reformation period, that it was completely lost. And so it existed only in the early church and died out. So that's what they were saying. Pastor Brett says, I did a live stream on this video yesterday after watching the whole video. Please check it out. Yes, I have watched that, Brett. I did watch that today. So I listened to a lot of it. 21st Century Blues says, I am amazed and disappointed when people I highly respect, like Anthony Rogers, quotes the Septuagint and uses it to correct the Masoretic. Yes, and we see a lot of these Bible versions today. It's just, let's just go to the Septuagint. It just seems like a trend. It's a fad. Pastor Brett says, I told him that his history was not an issue for me. I challenged him on the trustworthiness of his text. He says he is King James Version only, but he propagates the Septuagint. Okay, which one, John? There are different versions. Yes, so this is a really good point that Pastor Brett's bringing up. There are different editions of the LXX, and that's the thing. People say, oh, the LXX says this, and it's like, well, see, even here, some of the editions of the LXX have this error, that Methuselah survived the flood by 14 years because the numbers are out. The numbers are wrong. So, and there's hundreds of other errors like this. And so you get one edition of the Septuagint, you look at another, and it's like, oh, hang on, they're so different. And as William Whitaker said, it differs amazingly from the Hebrew. We should just be going back to the Hebrew. And so, okay, I'll just drop that down. Pastor Brett says his followers dove in. They were talking to me as if I were a follower of Ruckman. Well, you're a textual absolutist, which means you just think that God has one Bible, which is, it's quite strange because these guys inadvertently are textual absolutists. They know for certain 1 John 5:7 shouldn't be in there, which is absolutism. They're absolutely sure. They're absolutely sure the Precipate Adulteri shouldn't be in there. It should be taken out of modern Bibles, but unfortunately they leave it in, and they're 100% sure. They're absolutely sure. So it's just it's the same coin, different sides. We're sure it should be in, so we're absolutists. They're sure it should be out, but they've got confidence. It's just labeling. It's just calling people names, pigeonholing. The critical text guys are obsessed with the scarecrow term King James only, because they know it works. If you say, hey, I follow the King James, people are like, oh, you're not one of those King James only people, are you? And it's like, why would you jump to these conclusions about people that they're all Ruckmanites? And, it's just the church is just being browbeaten with this. It's a really good advertising campaign. So if you say something like, anything nowadays, the woke crowd will just say you're sexist, you're racist, you're, whatever. You just get labeled just for talking. I believe the Bible like they did 200 years ago. What? You're in a cult? I didn't know that, Pastor Brett says, I went in with my KJV and tried to reach them. That's good. Victor 5 says, William Cuppy, the decline and fall of practically everybody. Okay. Pastor Brett says they would not hear the word through me. Tony's Coffee House says hi. Pastor Brett says the LXX is not part of the canon. The Bible was not translated from it. Yes, absolutely. Pastor Brett says it's filled with pseudepigrapha. Therefore, it is not trustworthy. I'll look at it later. Thanks, Nick. And Tony's Coffee House is laughing out loud. Okay, so let's continue.
He discussed the translation of the Hebrew word alma, which means young woman, as Parthenos, in the Greek Septuagint, which means virgin. In chapter 71 of that book, Justin Martyr wrote, but I am far from putting reliance in your teachings, who refuse to admit that the interpretation made by the 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, the king of the Egyptians, is a correct one, and they attempt to frame another. And I wish you to observe that they have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations affected by those 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, and by which this very man who was crucified is proved to have been set forth expressly as God and man, and as being crucified and as dying. But since I am aware that this is denied by all of your nation, I do not address myself to these points, but I proceed to carry on my discussions by means of those passages which are still admitted by you. For you assent to those which I have brought before your attention, except that you contradict the statement, behold, the virgin shall conceive, and say it ought to read, behold, the young woman shall conceive. And I promise to prove that the prophecy referred not to you, not as you were taught to Hezekiah, but to this Christ of mine, and now I shall go to the proof. If the Septuagint is a 4th century AD forgery, then the conspirators would have had to collect and change chapter 71 of Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho to insert this exchange more than 200 years after it was written. Now here's the
So notice he's going to this extreme of 400. And he's sort of conflating two things where we think that's where they're getting the Septuagint, the modern Septuagint from, which Whitaker's saying is hopelessly corrupted. But most KJV people go, okay, well, it's probably the 5th column of Origen's hexapla. And that's like, I mean, I'm pretty sure even Ruckman taught that. I mean, D.A. Waite definitely taught it. The Dean Burgon Society has taught it. But then there are other people like the Trinitarian Bible Society. They think that Jesus used the Septuagint. And so, but I'm pretty sure that they think that the Septuagint was different, like a bit like what I was explaining before, that it has been sort of completely changed for them, from the Reformation onwards. People have recognized, hang on, this is a corrupted document. the one they had earlier was better. And so, but they still do claim that Jesus used it and the apostles used it. Where I think that whole notion is ridiculous and easily debunked. And so, but yeah, good to see a few people in the house. Good to see you, TurretinFan and a few others. I just sort of read your thing, but didn't really say hello. Tony's Coffee's house is saying you're funny. I think I am too. Quad Rex says, I am King James mostly. It is the best translation for an English speaker that adequately preserves inspiration. It's got a couple of spots where it could be clarified, such as 2 Thessalonians 2 minor stuff. Okay, I would say that 2 Thessalonians 2, I'd sort of like specifics and exactly where there's problems, because a lot of the time these things have been answered. And I find when people throw things at me, if I study into them, like Revelation 16:5 was thrown at me as a mistake in the King James, I studied it thoroughly, wrote a book about it, and came to the conclusion that absolutely Revelation 16:5 is not only just it's not only not an error, but it is such an amazing verse. Just some random verse in the middle of the book of Revelation was just like, this is incredible. And so, but yeah, so we're talking about the Septuagint here. Okay, so I might even read this. So I was just searching around because a lot of people are saying, look at David Daniels' material. And it's like, okay, well, he did write a book on it. Now, I do have that book in Kindle, but I've never read it. But what I might do, because it's nearly midnight here, and so I probably won't do my usual 15-hour video, but I might just go for a couple of hours. I might go for another like 10 minutes. But I'll sort of get this up to a point where perhaps he's talking about a few scriptures. And then when I do the next video talking about Jonathan Burris, I can go through some of these examples, or maybe I can go through one or two of them tonight, but I'll just continue on for a little bit.
Absolute most stressing concern I have for those who believe that the Septuagint is a 4th century AD forgery. Jesus quoted it. The New Testament often.
You see, like, Jesus quoted it. It's just like an absolute fact. Jesus quoted it, and it's just not questioned. I mean, the thing is, that needs to be questioned, that Jesus quoted the Septuagint. Is there a possibility that things were copied and pasted, copied from the New Testament into the Old? Now we see Romans chapter 3 was copied, like the whole section from Romans chapter 3 verse 10 all the way through, when it's talking about their mouth is an open sepulcher, and it goes all the way down to all of sin and fall short of the glory of God. Like the whole section is copied and pasted into a psalm. And so they were doing that. There are many places where they were copying and pasting from the New Testament into the Old Greek Old Testament, because sometimes they copied it into the wrong place. So you can see where they've attempted to do this and say, hang on, that's in the wrong place. So they were doing that. So just to go, no, Jesus quoted it. It's like, well, just think for a while. And the thing is, like, Jonathan Burris is coming against King James people, TR people, textual absolutists. And so why isn't he representing us properly, steel manning our position and saying, well, yeah, sure, this guy who we don't know about, said it's 4th century forgery or whatever he said. But why doesn't he, say, okay, well, D.A. Waite says this, and Scott Jones wrote this, and David Daniels says this, and why doesn't he do that? Because he wants to go to this sort of weird argument, so then he can just sort of say a whole bunch of stuff, and he's not really saying things that are completely like watertight. Like just saying that Jesus quoted the Septuagint. There's so much baggage that goes with a statement like that, because, and then Jonathan Burris and others see he's first off, even if I was to believe there was a Greek Bible done back then, in the Reformation period, people like Whitaker are saying it's probably what we have in our hands today is nothing like what the early church had. So why isn't he even looking at that? As Whitaker said that he should respect Whitaker. It's not Ruckman, it's not Waite, it's not Riddle, it's not Sayers. Look at that option, but it's not even considered. He's just like, no, the Septuagint they had then is what we have in our hands today. And it's like, no, the scholarship of the Reformation would like, no, that's not true. If it was conformable to the Hebrew, what we have in our hands today is corrupt, miserably corrupted. That's what Whitaker said. So Coffee House says, I just found you subbed. Okay. Textual Absolutist. Yes. You feel like doing a Nazi salute or something after that, like Heil Hitler, It's Textual Absolutist. You're it doesn't sound good, does it? Like if I said these people came around, they're absolutists, you think, oh, what's happened? But if it's like, oh no, they're the Textual Confidence Collective, it's like, that sounds so palatable, so nice. Matt Singleton says, I have Daniel's book, but I'm not mailing it. No, that's fine. I can easily get his stuff on Kindle. 2 Thessalonians 2, the translation of the falling away, which is probably better translated as a departure, like previous English translations of the same manuscripts rendered it, just minor stuff. I would say the falling away is actually a very good translation of apostasia. Okay, so just hear me out here. So the apostasia, the word apostasia, apo means from, and stasis means standing. So if you're moved from standing, you've fallen away. Now, what it actually means is a physical departure. Okay, so it's the opposite side of the coin to a harpazo. A harpazo means like it's like a rapture. Now, the word rape didn't always involve like, a sexual type of connotation. It was actually like to rape and pillage was actually to steal. It meant to snatch, and so the word rapture means to snatch, to steal. It's like you grabbing something, And so when you look at the word harpazo and you study through that, it means that like a snatching with violence sort of thing. And that's what's going to happen. We will be caught up. So the catching up happens. And so if we use the word falling away, even today, like I was explaining this on the phone to someone who didn't believe what I believe about the falling away. And they were just chatting away, and they said, yeah, some of my friends, they fell away, and that they ended up doing some football thing. And I'm thinking, you're using that language, falling away. It means they departed. We would say someone in church, oh, yeah, well, they're no longer in church. They fell away. That could be falling away from fellowship. They're falling away from God. It means they departed. So we still use that as a synonymous term. What's happened is the word falling away, people have locked that in with what Paul used as the falling away in, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1-3, where it's saying in the last days there'll be there will be a falling away. Oh, actually, no, it's in, I'm pretty sure Timothy wrote it. Paul wrote it to Timothy, And it's like, in the last days, anyway, I should really, I'll type it in. I'm just trying to remember it. Falling away. KJV. Okay, verses about falling away. Yes. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith. So it's like a falling away from the faith. So usually what happens in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, people add the words of the faith. They say a falling away of the faith, or the great falling away, or the great falling away from the faith. So that they make these distinctions, but clearly it just says a falling away, which means a departure. So just say the rapture of the church happens, a harpazo. People who are left behind, they've seen all these people go. What words would they use? They would say they've fallen away. They've departed from our fellowship. If you're in a church and people have fallen away, they're gone. They're no longer there. Or they've fallen away from your fellowship. Some friends fall away. We use this language. We still use this type of language. And so falling away isn't actually wrong. It's just because people have squeezed the theological baggage into there. And modern versions say that apostasia has to always do with theological apostasy. And someone like Alan Kirshner, he says, well, it can never be a spatial departure, okay? Meaning a departure of something. It has to be a philosophical departure, a departure from the faith, or a departure from, some sort of concept, an idea. It's like, oh, well, I've fallen away, I've apostatized, or and it is used like that in because it only appears twice in the New Testament. And so when we look at the other appearance, it's in Acts 21, I think it is, where it says Moses, they're accusing Paul of teaching people to forsake Moses. So when they're saying that, forsake the teachings of Moses, to circumcise and all that sort of stuff. So that's an obvious departure, forsaking of the teachings. Okay, so that's why they go, oh, see, it means, that's what it means there. No, you've got a lexical definition, but you've got to have the contextual definition. Contextual definition in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, when you look at that, it's clearly matching up with verse 7, when it says, he that letteth shall let until he be taken out of the way, and then that man's sin shall be revealed. If you look at verse 3, it says, there shall be a falling away first, and then that man's sin will be revealed. It's very similar to verse 7. And so if you understand that the he being taken away is equivalent to the falling away, but coming from a perspective where you're in the tribulation, if you've seen the rapture happen, you're left behind and other people have left. They've departed from your company. It makes perfect sense. And so understanding that is the rapture of the church is probably the strongest verse for a pre-trib rapture. It says that this shall occur first. And so the day of Christ will occur. The day of the Lord Jesus Christ will occur. And that's the 70th week of Daniel. Then that will continue on through the millennium, and then through until the new heavens and new earth are built. That's what it says in 2 Peter chapter 3. It talks about the day of the Lord coming as a thief in the night, and it talks about the earth and the heavens being destroyed, and a new heavens, new earth. So that's the day of the Lord, includes all right up until then. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of help there with that verse. I would say, maybe you've commented a little bit more, but I would say that's a very, it's a bit like looking at the number 9 and the number 6. Depending on your perspective, a lot of people go, well, how can that? Well, let me just explain it this way. there is a pseudo, well, I guess you call it an apocryphal narrative of the Assumption of Mary. Okay, so it's obviously not something that I would read and get benefit from or whatever, but it is. It does talk about the rapture, not the rapture of the church, but a rapture of all the disciples and Mary. So it's obviously a story that's made up, but it's in Koine Greek. Okay, so Koine Greek went right up until about 650. People make out the Koine Greek was only this small little period, 200 years before Jesus, 200 years after, and that's it. You know, people who do that, they know that, you know, other works before and after, you know, right off their position. Especially a word that only appears twice in the Bible. It's not going to be used in a whole bunch of other literature. But we do see in the Assumption of Mary that, so that basically, you know, the story that you know, it's fantastical, but it uses the word apostasia there. Mary and the disciples were promised by God that they would be raptured from Bethlehem to Jerusalem when the soldiers came to kill them. Okay, so that happened. They got taken. Then the soldiers came, and it says they didn't know that the apostasia had happened. So that is equivalent to a rapture. So this is in apocryphal works. Why are apocryphal works using this word for a rapture? It's quite amazing. And so also, if you go through the Septuagint, Alan Kirshner said that the word apostasia is never used as a spatial departure. Well, it's clearly in the Assumption of Mary, there it is. But if you go to the Septuagint, King Ahaz, he removed the vessels from the temple, and then they were put back, okay? And when it's talking about this removal, it uses the word apostasia, which means it's a spatial departure. It's a departure of the vessels. So it's not just a philosophical departure, is it? The vessels were literally taken from the temple. So this is where Alan Kirshner is wrong. So Alan Kirshner, he helped James White write the King James Only Controversy. He's thanked in the preface for that, but he's completely wrong on that issue. And I'll debate anyone, anywhere, anytime on that issue, and I'll debate Alan Kirshner. I'd love to debate him on that issue. I noticed he debated Thomas Ice on that same issue, and at the time I listened to it, I didn't agree with Thomas Ice, but now I do. I changed that position about a year ago. The falling away concept, I used to just think it was a falling away from faith. It was just like this big apostasy that everyone's just going to believe something weird and then the end will come sort of thing. It's like, no, it's a departure. And that's Geneva Bible just says departure, you know. So, but once you start thinking of falling away is a good translation, and you keep thinking that way, and you keep reminding yourself it's just a simple departure, you realize, no, it is a good translation of that. And so Matt Singleton says, but his channel goes over the issues by video. Yes, that would be good to go through, actually, David Daniels' material. Coffee Shop says, yep, also other books like Enoch. Matt Singleton says, while Burris is smarter than Ward, he still is not the sharpest tool in the shed. Brian, a socialite, is saying, hey, guys. Hey, Brian. Matt Singleton says, Jesus disagrees with the Septuagint in several places. Yes. Brian, a socialite, says, I'm showing up quite late here. I spent my morning reading Romans 1 to 11 before I picked up my phone. Well, that's really good. It's good to set aside time, get the Bible in there, and then dive into the world. Calvin Clemens says Jesus is the Word of God. Not only that, he is God manifest in the flesh. Therefore, he would have no need to quote a single word from any written document. The end. Yeah, and I think the thing is, people have put upon the early church that every time they're even alluding to the Old Testament, they have to be quoting exactly as it would be translated from Hebrew to Greek. And it's like, no, they don't have to be. You can, I sometimes I'm quoting something. I'll say, for God so loved the world, that's you and me, that he gave his only begotten son, that's Jesus, that whosoever believes in him, that's anyone who believes in him, puts their faith and trust in him, shall not perish, that's in hell, but have everlasting life, that's in heaven. I add to the words of God doing that. I'm expounding on the scriptures. And so, I think Paul did that. I think Jesus did that. It's all the way. Like, if you look at how people in the Old Testament are quoting other people, they'll say, "Oh, this king said this," or "This person said this." Oftentimes it's not just copy and paste. It's just that they're explaining things and they're embellishing on other things, and so when it's like, Jesus opened the scroll in the temple, what he couldn't just elaborate on some things, and Luke just wrote down exactly what he said. Well, he had to just go, okay, and just we're putting in to what is in the first century, what happens in like an Anglican liturgy. It's like, okay, or in some churches, like, we got Bob, come to the pulpit and read this verse. Okay, and just read through it. Now, it says Jesus opened the scripture, and he could have said hundreds of things. He could have preached for 3 hours. We don't know. But he also said, this is fulfilled in your midst. And they went to cast him out. Where does it say that in the text? He was interjecting. And so we're going to look at that. But I think it would be more favorable to look at it another time, because obviously it's getting late here. It's past midnight, and I can turn into a pumpkin at any moment. Victo5 says, do you have evidence that the LXX was used in the synagogues in Israel? I don't think they do, but we're going to examine that a little bit further. Brian says the Septuagint is really interesting to me personally. I haven't looked too much into it though, but I kind of don't have the best personal perspective of it. Modern day Septuagint onlyists, at the very least in the online Christian sphere, usually tend to be anti-Semitic in one way or another. Okay, that's interesting. Brian says, I used to know of a neo-Nazi Lutheran podcast, and both of the hosts of that podcast were hardcore Septuagint onlyists, and both despised any use of the Masoretic text. They also hated the KJV too. Yeah, it's interesting. I have known some Greeks, because Australia has a lot of Greeks, and some Greeks to be really aligned with Nazis. I remember one guy, he's probably passed away now. He was quite aged when he told me this story. He said when he grew up in Greece, he remembered the Nazis came to his house, and his father was involved with the Greek resistance movement. And so the Nazis came to his house, and he said the whole house was just in fear. Like, they thought that was it. They're going to die. And then one of the Nazis, as they were talking and sort of interrogating him a little bit, one of the Nazis just was looking at his bookshelf, and he had a book there that was anti-Semitic against the Jews. And he said, do you read this author? And he said, yes, I like that book, And then he just said to the other guy, the other officer, okay, let's go. And they left. Because he had anti-Semitic literature in his house, the whole family were able to survive. And you know what it's like. That was in Greece. Okay, so which is very interesting. I'm pretty sure Mussolini just invaded Greece, and Hitler just had to send a bunch of Nazis down there. but yeah, so it goes to show you that the anti-Semitism was in Greece as well. Now, I'm not saying whether, what that book was or whatever. I'm just sharing a story of someone I know. He told me that personally. I don't know of anyone else in the world who's ever heard that story. But yeah, he was just explaining what his life was like when he was growing up in Greece. And so there can be what is deemed as anti-Semitic, an anti-Semitic movement in the Greek speaking world, I guess you'd call it. The TurretinFan says the letter of Pseudo Aristeas is a forgery, but it's a forgery made before the incarnation. Okay, so that is an option. So that's something that I'm looking at and thinking about and going, okay, I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure if some of these other documents are actually, after a document was made, like say a Greek Septuagint was made, and when I call it a Septuagint, I'm just saying a Greek Old Testament was made in the early church period, and then people are trying to justify that, religious type of people, because we know that not everyone who's into Christianity in those days, was genuine or was always honest. And so anyway, that is an option, and it is something that I'm looking into and thinking about. It does seem like Metzger is probably having that type of understanding as well. Motorhead 1 says, after the Civil War, Hanukkah between Jews, Hellenistic apostates, Greek versus Orthodox Jews. No Jews are allowed to write any holy thing in Greek. Okay. Says rough stuff. Brian, a socialite. Motorhead 1 says the Septuagint, 72 rabbis were forced to translate into Greek. Was only Genesis to Deuteronomy only. Apostate Hellenistic Greeks put together the LXX later. So yeah, I noticed that was said earlier, but apparently that comes from the Talmud, according to Jonathan Burris. So that would be an interesting thing to look at. So then we've got some Hebrew words here. Rabashalim. Okay, LXX Septuagint removes Isaiah 2:22 and modified and edited the Hebrew scripture. Yes, so we go with the Hebrew over and above any Greek translation of it. Motorhead 1 says, yeah, I've heard of that. Doesn't the LXX also have shortened versions of certain chapters of some books like Jeremiah? Yeah, apparently Jeremiah is like 1/3 shorter than the Hebrew. So that's a huge corruption, according to me and many other people. So I've sort of caught up here, and I know that Jonathan Burris, he starts going into some of these examples like Isaiah 60, Deuteronomy 6:13, Psalm 8:2, and a few other things. So I'll make a second part to this. I'm just wondering what else I can say. I was going to look at a David Daniels, what is the Septuagint article? But I might, rather than me just going through it and trying to read it with my tired eyes, I'll stop this feed before I start yawning like I am. And yeah, so I'll pull the pin on this. Thanks for joining us, guys. God bless you. And what else do we have coming up? We haven't got any debates lined up or anything like that. I guess I was just like, I want to do some debates, and now I've done a couple. I'm like, okay, cool. it takes a lot of effort. I guess, you know, something like what Donny's got going, he's constantly just doing debates and debates. And, you know, I guess, you know, me just doing this part-time, it's pretty full on. But I have enjoyed doing interviews. And so maybe I could even, maybe you guys could suggest some interviews. And it doesn't have to all just be on issues like King James issues or whatever, Textus Receptus issues. We can talk about, I don't know, someone who believes something that I prefer it, like if they believe something that I believe, you know, because, you know, I get right into it. If it's something that I don't believe, it is hard, and I'm like, well, why am I promoting this sort of thing? But I do want to get everyone's perspective as well. So there's that side of the coin where even like this Jehovah's Witness guy I'm working with, you know, he thinks I'm having a go at him, but I actually want to know what he thinks. So I was like, what about 1914? You know, and it's sort of like, oh, well, that's when the end times started. It's getting worse and worse since 1914. It's like, okay, well, that's interesting. You know, getting it from the horse's mouth oftentimes is way better than, you know, just reading books about stuff and what other people say about the group. Someone in the group saying, oh, this is what I think and this is what I believe. It's like, okay, well, now I understand your group better. But anyway, I might shut this down. God bless you guys. Thanks for joining, and we will see you in the next Revolution video.